The Libor scandal and Sharia bonds are today's top picks from Reuters Breakingviews. First up, what if banks boycotted Libor? And once pricey Islamic bonds are now at tempting prices. With me to discuss these stories is Reuters Breakingviews' Peter Tal-Larsen. Peter, simple enough question. What if banks boycotted Libor?
Well, it's an interesting question.
What's the answer?
I mean, the reason we're writing about this is because some of the banks we've seen banks pulling out of rate setting panels in Singapore and in Tokyo and so forth. Not necessarily for these reasons. Sometimes banks are pulling back or something. They think it's no longer relevant for them to be involved in that. But clearly, the Libor setting process is a voluntary process. You know, banks participate on a voluntary basis, and they really don't get any huge benefit out of being part of it. And obviously, in the context of what's happening with Barclays now, there is a massive potential legal risk with being involved in setting this process, particularly if you find yourself in the situation as Barclays appears to have done, where the central bank is encouraging you to submit lower rates and then you get whacked for it afterwards. So it's prompted this question, which is, what if banks pulled out of the Libor process? What if they said, we just don't want to bear these legal risks? It's a voluntary process. We don't want to be part of it. And it's potentially very, very unsettling, because what you have is a panel of banks that on a daily basis put these rates together, and if you don't have enough banks, then you undermine confidence in this benchmark, which, even though we know it's flawed and probably needs to be reformed, is still the basis for tens of trillions of dollars of loans and derivatives contracts.
And these are the biggest banks that contribute rates to Libor, so if you take them away, and then you get smaller banks, maybe even less credible.
Well,
perhaps.
you might have to patch it together with some other banks that kind of submitted rates, but then would any other bank really want to go onto a Libor panel at the moment? I can't really see it. And so you potentially have anyway, whatever would happen is that you might undermine confidence in this benchmark. Now, I think common sense will prevail. I mean, the banks may think there's a legal risk here, but obviously the market risk, if there was to be sort of an uncertainty over, an even greater uncertainty over Libor, would probably far outweigh any legal risk. So I suspect that when it comes down to it, they'll say, well, we'll stick with it. But it just shows that there's real pressure now on the regulators to think about not just kind of how they're going to reform Libor, but how quickly they can do it, because they really need to set out a clear direction towards a new benchmark and give people confidence that what we've got at the moment will hold together until they can get the new system in place.
So, what you're saying is that it's a flawed system, but it's the only one we've got. It kind of reminds you of the Churchill quote about democracy. It's the worst form of government apart from all the rest.
Well, yes. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether you could. I think Libor can probably be improved upon, but the problem is that you need to come up with something new before you get rid of it. You decommission the old one, and that's really the problem at the moment. We don't know what the new Libor or its alternative looks like.
Okay, moving on to Islamic bonds. These bonds are drawing interest from far beyond the Middle East. Is this just because the yields offered by more conventional bonds in more developed markets are just so low and so unattractive?
Well, actually, but what's happening is with Islamic bonds, Islamic bonds have historically priced at a premium to conventional bonds, and that's, all other things being equal, you would expect that to be the case, because in order to issue an Islamic bond, you have to go through more paperwork, you have to set up a pool of Sharia compliant assets, you have to get the whole structure sort of blessed by scholars and so forth. So historically there's been a premium. What's actually happened now, though, is that Sharia bonds are trading on tighter yields than their conventional equivalents where they exist. And so we saw an issue from Qatar the other day. They had $25 billion of interest for a $4 billion bond, and apparently it priced 10 basis points tighter than it would have done if they'd sold a conventional bond. Now, part of that is just flight to safety. People are looking to put their money somewhere where they think it's safe. But part of it is also there is this big pool of Sharia compliant money sitting in Islamic banks, which really can only go into these kind of bonds. It can't go into all the other stuff, and that means it's getting attractive for issuers to issue Sharia compliant bonds.
Is there any way of Western banks, American, European banks, to get involved in this process?
Well, for the banks, they can get involved, obviously, in arranging them. I mean, I think the interesting question is really whether issuers can start issuing. I mean, GE did an Islamic bond in 2009. Others are sort of apparently thinking about following suit. It's not that straightforward because of all the paperwork that I described earlier, and you then also need to kind of appeal to these Islamic banks, you have to have a story that kind of makes sense for them. But clearly, with the pricing, with the pool of capital that's there growing, and the pricing getting tighter, I think that demand will be tested.
So it's just to finish up, it's an example of capital preservation.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also a captive pool of capital which is going into these types of bonds and not into everything else. So that means that there's sort of a little kind of pocket of demand that can be tapped into.
Peter, thank you very much. That's all for now. My thanks to Peter Tal Larsen. For more financial insight, watch our US Breaking Views show every day at 12:30 Eastern, 17:30 BST. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.